Does RAM choice really matter for AMD Ryzen X3D CPUs? In this video, we are going to find out. My name is Matt, I'm a former rocket scientist, and my goal is to help you make the right component choices and put them together the right way every single time. In the Is It Worth It series, we've been helping you make the right choice by showing you just how much you can expect to increase performance with a drop-in upgrade. In this video, our focus will be on measuring the impact of memory speed, latency, rank, and infinity fabric speed on AM5-based Ryzen X3D CPUs. In addition to showing you benchmarks across 10 games, I will also demystify the AM5 memory architecture and show how the 3-core clocks impact system performance. And if you stick around, I'll show you how to optimize your core clocks, something every AMD Ryzen CPU user will definitely not want to miss. It's really not rocket science, so before we jump into the benchmarks, let's first demystify the AMD AM5 platform. AMD introduced the Socket AM5 chipset in September of 2022, together with the launch of Zen 4 7000 series CPUs. Early DDR5 memory stability on AM5 was not great. I had a lot of trouble getting DDR5-6000 Expos stable at launch. These issues were slowly ironed out, and in July of 2023, AMD released a GISA 1.007B, which provided enhanced stability together with a massive speed boost. With this enhanced support came an expansion of Expo memory kits from 6000 all the way up to 8000. And with the GISA update 1.2.0.3F, larger capacity 64GB modules are now also supported. With so many memory options now available, the question I see a lot from AMD Ryzen CPU owners is, which memory kit should I buy? AMD's memory recommendation for AM5 based Ryzen CPUs is 6000 megatransfers per second. The primary reason they recommend this speed is because DDR5-6000 RAM combined with default motherboard settings will be stable on virtually all AM5 Ryzen based systems. This doesn't mean that other kits won't be stable, but for big companies like AMD, they try to minimize risk, and the best way to do that is to recommend something that will work for everyone, not something that will provide the best performance. So to determine what memory kit to buy to maximize performance, we first need to understand the Ryzen CPU architecture better. For AM5 based Ryzen CPUs, there are only 3 core clocks that you need to understand in order to learn how to select the right memory kit. The best way to explain them is with a simple graphic showing the key CPU elements and how they interact with each other. On the I/O die, there are a few core elements that are important to understand. The first is the infinity fabric, which runs at FCLK. This is how the CPU passes information from each core complex die, or CCD, to the unified memory controller. The memory controller runs at UCLK and is essentially the component that connects the CCDs via the infinity fabric to the physical memory interface. The memory interface connects to the RAM DIMMs to pass information between the CPU and RAM, which runs at MCLK. So in order to extract max performance from an AM5 based system, you only need to optimize 3 core clocks. 1. The Unified Memory Controller Clock, or UCLK. 2. The Infinity Fabric Clock, or FCLK. And 3. The Memory Clock, or MCLK. But how do you do that? To optimize the core clocks, you first need to select a RAM kit that your system will support. The memory speed that you're able to run stable will depend heavily on the quality of your motherboard. So you can use your motherboard qualified vendor list, or QVL, to help guide you. However, as the memory speed increases, you'll be forced to run the unified memory controller at half the memory speed for your system. In BIOS, this is typically denoted by a UCLK mode option, which will show UCLK equal to MCLK, or 1-to-1 mode, and UCLK equals to MCLK divided by 2, or 2-to-1 mode as choices. Some motherboards will automatically switch to 2-to-1 mode when you set your memory speed above 6000 megatransfers per second. So if you buy a 6400 memory kit, I recommend setting this manually. It's also important to understand that the max UCLK that you'll be able to run stable will be heavily dependent on the quality of your CPU, often called the silicon lottery. The absolute maximum memory speed that you'll be able to run in 1-to-1 mode, if you get very lucky, is DDR5-6600, and that would be for a true golden sample chip. This is why memory manufacturers don't make 6600 Expo kits, because the chances of having it run stable are extremely low. Above 6600, you'll be forced to switch to 2-to-1 mode. However, speeds below about DDR5-7600 are not great options because your system will perform worse than simply running DDR5-6000 in 1-to-1 mode. So how do you select the best MCLK, UCLK, and FCLK combination? Stay tuned until after the benchmarks to find out. As mentioned earlier, the focus for this video is on measuring the impact of memory speed, latency, rank, and infinity fabric speed on AM5 based Ryzen X3D CPUs. The test system being used to run the benchmarks is my AMD AM5 Open Bench Table with the following components: For the CPU, we have an AMD Ryzen 9 9950 X3D. For the motherboard, we have an ASUS ROG Crosshair X870E Apex. For the GPU, we have an ASUS ROG Astral GeForce RTX 5090 OC Edition. For the CPU cooler, we have an ASUS ROG Ryo 3 360mm AIO. For storage, we have a 4TB Samsung 990 Pro NVMe Gen 4 M.2 SSD. And for the PSU, we have an ASUS ROG Thor 1200W Platinum 2 power supply. Affiliate links for all of these components are listed in the description below. All testing was performed with the Astral RTX 5090 at default clocks and the Ryzen 9 9950 X3D optimized with the following tweaks. 1. Set the PBO limits to motherboard. 2. Set PBO scaler to 2x. 3. Set the max CPU boost clock override to plus 100 MHz. 4. Set a negative per CCD curve offset. 5. Turned Expo on and set refresh interval to 65/535. And 6. Selected the balanced power plan and turned memory integrity off. A comprehensive step-by-step guide for how to implement all of these tweaks is contained within my What are the best settings for an AMD Ryzen CPU video. I selected a Ryzen 9 9950 X3D CPU for this testing to ensure that I am able to extract max performance, since it will perform like a 9800 X3D in gaming while offering significantly better performance in professional workloads. For RAM, I selected multiple kits and I tuned the primary timings to keep them as consistent as possible. In order to thoroughly test the memory, I ran the benchmarks at 1080p low settings. This will place maximum load on the CPU, which is the best way to determine if RAM speed will have any impact on gaming performance. I also decided against using frame generation for the benchmarks to avoid any biasing of the results. I did, however, use upscaling, but only when it was automatically selected as part of the standard graphics options, which when used is clearly denoted on the charts. Because of the large amount of test data for this video, I decided to break it down into smaller benchmark sections based on memory speed. For each chart, I show performance for the following RAM kits. 1. Baseline. This is the standard latency 32GB kit. 2. Low latency, a 32GB kit with much lower CAS latency or CL. 3. FCLK Plus, the baseline kit with a higher Infinity Fabric clock speed. And 4. Dual Rank, a 64GB kit with 2 independent 64-bit memory banks. After each section, I make some observations before proceeding to the next memory speed. I then wrap up the benchmarks by showing how the performance compares as a function of speed. So with this context now set and the memory kits ready to go, let's check the benchmarks. For DDR5-6000, I was able to match the primary timings for each kit, so these results show the true impact of each parameter change. When you look at the average performance, there doesn't appear to be any meaningful benefit to reducing latency, increasing the FCLK speed, or using dual rank DIMMs. In fact, with the exception of a few memory-heavy titles like Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, the impact of varying these parameters for DDR5-6000 RAM is negligible. That said, it's important to keep in mind that you can stack some of these RAM variables to achieve higher performance, such as lowering your CAS latency while also increasing your FCLK. But even if the FPS were to stack linearly, it still would not result in a meaningful performance increase. Let's see if this changes for DDR5-6400 RAM. For DDR5-6400, I was unable to run any of the kits stable at Expo 1 settings. To achieve stability, I had to increase the VDD and VDDQ quite a lot, which meant running them at 1.45 volts versus the 1.4 volt spec. Furthermore, I was unable to get my G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo 64GB kit stable, so I used a Corsair Dominator Titanium kit instead, and I tuned the primary timings to match the baseline timings. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the performance was not much better than using DDR5-6000, with average performance gains of only around 2% for the highest performing option, which was the dual rank kit. This relatively small performance gain is attributable to the additional L3 cache on X3D CPUs, which significantly reduces the need to access system RAM in most games. Now let's see if this trend continues for DDR5-8000 RAM. For DDR5-8000, dual rank kits are a relatively new option, and the only kit I was able to get my hands on was from V-Color. Unfortunately, this kit came with relatively loose primary timings, and I was unable to tighten these timings to match the baseline kit. So this is a big reason why the performance for the dual rank kit was somewhat underwhelming. That said, there was a relatively small increase in performance for the low latency kit, whereas increasing the FCLK, unlike for DDR5-6000 and 6400, had a somewhat negative impact. This will be explained later in the video, but is attributable to a loss of synchronization between the three clocks when in 2-to-1 mode. For the final set of benchmarks, let's compare the performance between speeds, with a comprehensive look at the baseline configuration, followed by a summary of the low latency and dual rank configurations. As you can see from the benchmark results, in professional workloads, a DDR5-8000 kit performed a little better, but there was no meaningful increase in performance across all tasks. This is also true for gaming, where the DDR5-8000 kit did perform better, especially in the 1% lows, but not in a meaningful way. It is also true for the low latency kits, where the DDR5-8000 1% low performance was only 1.2% higher than the DDR5-6000 kit. For the dual rank kits, DDR5-6400 performed best, but this is primarily due to the fact that the primary timings for the DDR5-8000 kit were much higher than the baseline kit. That said, if you want to run higher capacity dual rank RAM, I would still recommend DDR5-6000 since it's much easier to achieve stability. As explained in detail earlier in the video, extracting max performance from an AMD AM5 based system requires you to optimize 3 core clocks. But how do you select the best MCLK, UCLK, and FCLK combination? To help answer this question, I put together a table showing the optimum FCLK for a range of DDR5 RAM kit options. The second column shows the MCLK, which will be half the rated DDR5 speed, since DDR5 RAM is double data rate. In 1:1 mode, shown in blue, the UCLK will be equal to the MCLK. However, in 2:1 mode, shown in red, the UCLK will be half the MCLK. In 1:1 mode, it's not possible to run the FCLK at the same speed as the UCLK, so unlike older AM4 based systems, this means your system will not be synchronized. There should be a small benefit from running the FCLK at a 3:2 ratio, so for DDR5-6400 in 1:1 mode, that would mean an FCLK of 2133 MHz, but in practice you will get a small boost by simply running your FCLK as high as possible. In 2:1 mode, it's possible to run the FCLK at the same speed as the UCLK, so as a result, your clocks can now be synchronized. That means an optimum FCLK for DDR5-8000 in 2:1 mode would be 2000 MHz, and explains the phenomenon shown earlier where the gaming performance actually dropped when I increased the FCLK to 2100 MHz. Once you select your memory kit and mode, your MCLK and UCLK are locked in. So the only real choice you are left with is what FCLK to run. As I just showed, in 1:1 mode, your system will typically perform a little better at higher FCLK values. However, you will run into stability issues if you push it too high, which is why aiming for some form of synchronization is typically a good idea, even if it's fractional. If you do decide to push your FCLK as high as possible, a good rule of thumb is to push it until it no longer works and then back down 2 increments. Your FCLK should then be stable. With the release of AGESA 1.2.0.3F, AMD now offers support for higher capacity 64GB RAM modules on AM5 motherboards, allowing for configurations up to 256GB consisting of 4 64GB DIMMs. But is it worth it? For gaming, there is absolutely no value of installing 256GB of RAM because games simply won't use it. In fact, the looser timings that are required to achieve stability will actually hurt performance, as shown when I tested a kit of 128GB of RAM in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. The good news is that it does indeed run stable at the rated expo speeds. The bad news is that in order to run stable, the primary timings are higher, resulting in a relatively large performance hit, especially to the 1% lows. For professional workloads, however, such as video rendering, the additional capacity will be very helpful. That said, if you own a 4-DIMM motherboard and want to fully populate the RAM slots, I would highly recommend buying a fully matched 4-DIMM kit and not simply attempting to run 2 2-DIMM kits. Or at least make sure you loosen the timings to match one of the 4-DIMM kits. Otherwise, you will very likely be unable to run your memory stable. Which brings me to another important point. Unlike Intel systems that benefit from using 2-DIMM motherboards, there is absolutely no benefit for AMD AM5 systems. I was able to achieve the exact same memory stability on my ROG Crosshair X870E Apex, which is a 2-DIMM motherboard specifically designed for overclocking, as I was on my Hero, which is a more conventional 4-DIMM motherboard. So if you have an AMD Ryzen CPU, save your money and just get a 4-DIMM board. In this video, I tested DDR5 Expo RAM to see if buying higher speed, lower latency, or higher ranked memory for AMD X3D chips is really worth it. As you can see from the high-level benchmark summary, it was a clear victory for DDR5-8000, winning 70% of the games, with 6000 winning 20% and 6400 only winning 10%. However, if we look at the average performance across 10 games, we see that the margin of victory was small, with the baseline DDR5-8000 kit only able to improve performance by around 1%, which is not meaningful. The same trend occurs when we compare the low latency kits as well, with the DDR5-8000 kit able to deliver the highest 1% lows, even though the margin was again small. If you now look at the dual rank kits, it was the DDR5-6400 kit that was able to deliver max average performance, but again, the margin was only around 1%. These are somewhat disappointing results, however, they do highlight the value of the extra L3 cache on X3D chips, which significantly reduces the performance impact of using lower spec RAM. If we now look at power efficiency, it's clear that there is a small power penalty when running higher speed RAM, but again, the difference is relatively small and not meaningful. So what happens when we look at cost? A baseline DDR5-6000 CL30 kit currently retails for $125 US, with a kit of 6400 CL32 selling for around $140. However, a kit of high-speed 8000 CL40 is selling for around $170, which is a 36% premium over 6000. If you now convert that difference into gaming efficiency or FPS per dollar, then it's clear that the 6000 kit delivers significantly better value, with the 8000 kit a long way behind. This improves a little when you look at FPS per dollar for low latency RAM, with the 6400 kit now delivering almost identical value to the 6000 kit, but gets even worse when you look at the dual rank value chart, with the high cost of the 8000 64GB kit making it terrible value. So the answer to the question of whether RAM choice matters for AM5 based Ryzen X3D CPUs is a resounding no. If you have an AM5 based Ryzen X3D CPU, it's not worth buying a higher speed, lower latency, or dual rank memory kit. You will get a small improvement in gaming performance with DDR5-8000, however, you will have to pay a large premium for it. One thing to also keep in mind is that this is the best case scenario at 1080p low settings. So if you game at higher resolutions and settings, your reliance on RAM will be reduced even further, which in turn means lower performance increases, making higher spec RAM even worse value. If however you are using a non-X3D chip, such as the 9700X, the performance gain will be higher, but the cost premium will still make it a poor choice. So my strong recommendation for any AMD AM5 Ryzen CPU owner is to save your money and stick with the DDR5-6000 CL30 kit. It may sound cool to run higher speed memory, but it's simply not worth it for AM5 based Ryzen X3D CPUs. Remember, it's not rocket science, it's Lego. My goal is to help you make the right component choices and put them together the right way every single time. Thank you for watching this video in the Is It Worth It upgrade series. If you enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And if you'd like to support the channel further and gain access to live Q&A sessions, please also consider joining our new school community. Bye for now.